ka Rerichi seltsi ja Rerichi pakti ümmarguste tähtpäevadega. Nii et ka neid sündmusi peaksime me meeles pidama, sellepärast et kõik need ideed, millest tuleb ka juttu, need on väga paljus jõudnud inimesteni tänu Rerichi tegevusele. Mul on väga hea meel, et aselinnapea on traditsiooniliselt meiega, see on juba hea traditsioon, mis loodetavasti jätkub pikalt. Ja ma annaksin härra Belobrovtsevale sõna väikeseks tervituseks. Aitäh!
Tere päevast, добрый день всем. Good afternoon, everybody. Меня, как всегда, вопрос, на каком языке говорить?
Eesti keeles.
Eesti keeles, teeme eesti keelt. Ma selles mõttes natuke võib-olla keeruline praegu, kuna mul tund aega oli praegu üks vestlus Euroopa Nõukogu ajakirjanikega või esindajatega nagu siin kõrvalmajas. Tund aega ma rääkisin inglise keeles, nüüd ma pean veel eesti keeles rääkima. Aga okei. Esiteks lubage teid kõiki tervitada siin Tallinna linna nimel. Mul on hea meel, et Rerichi selts tegutseb Eestis aktiivselt. Vahel nii aktiivselt, et ma juba nagu vajan peast kinni, aga see ongi hea, sest kui see ei ole aktiivne, siis sind ei olegi olemas. Ja ma arvan, et nagu David ütles, sellest saab ilus traditsioon, et abilinnapea on siin, sellest ma arvan, on juba saanud ilus traditsioon, et Tallinna linn siis Rerichi seltsi üritusi ka toetab. Nii et meil on hea meel seda ka edaspidi teha. Seega võite meid ka edaspidi tülitada ja me hea meelega aitame. Miks me seda teeme? Ma arvan, et see on lihtne, sest kui meil tekib arutlus näiteks komisjonis, mis siis jagab neid toetusi, siis kui tulevad Rerichi seltsi projektid, siis seal tavaliselt suurt arutelu ei toimu, sellepärast et kõik saavad aru, et tegu on olulise asjaga. Ja see oluline asi puudutab põhimõtteliselt meid kõiki, sest kultuuri kaitse, kultuuriobjektide kaitse üle maailma on selline asi, mis tõepoolest puudutab igaüht. Ja siin ei saa öelda, et see mind ei huvita ja mind ei puuduta. Nii et ma arvan, et eriti oluline on see, et me räägime nendel teemadel, kaasa arvatud need teemad, mis tulevad täna arutlusele, alustades siis Beirutist ja lõpetades Blue teemadega. Need on eriti aktuaalsed just praegu, sest viimased 1,5 aastat on tegelikult näidanud seda, et me ei saa mitte millestki kindlad olla, sest täna me elame oma tavapärast elu ja homme järsku kõik pannakse kinni. Me hakkame kõik maske kandma, see ei ole kõige suurem probleem veel. Ja inimesed hakkavad me ümber lihtsalt niisama surema. Nii et see ei ole väga selline lõbus lugu, aga tõepoolest aeg on praegu selline, et me ei tea, mida toob kaasa lähitulevik, rääkimata kaugemast tulevikust. Ja nendes oludes, ma arvan, sellised igavesed väärtused, milleks on kindlasti kultuur, kultuurilised objektid üle maailma, muutuvad aina hinnalisemaks. Me peame mõtlema selle peale, et kui tõepoolest kõik on nii ettearvamatud, siis me peame tegelema just meie kultuuri kaitsmisega. Ja jällegi, kas või see sama Beiruti case, millest lugupeetud ettekandja hakkab kohe rääkima, näitas seda, et põhimõtteliselt isegi mitte 1 minutiga, 1 sekundiga võib olukord muutuda väga drastiliseks. Ja me peame selleks valmis olema. See on täpselt nagu see pandeemia, kus me ütleme, et me ei tea, mida toob järgmine sügis või ülejärgmine sügis ja nii edasi juba eelmisest aastast. aga tegelikult me peame selleks valmis olema, me peame selleks valmistuma. Üks selline peaaegu geniaalne lause kõlas ühe meie tuntud arsti suust, kelleks on siis doktor Karl von Habsburg, kes sai pandeemia ajal väga tuntuks tänu oma siis kiirele tegutsemisele ja professionaalsusele, kes siis ütles, et kui tema käest küsiti siin, kui ma ei eksi, siis kuskil seal aprilli-maikuus, et mida te siis suvel hakkate tegema, siis ta ütles nagu suvel ma lähen puhkama ja valmistuma ette 3. laineks sügisel, mida ei tule. Ja miks see on peaaegu geniaalne, sellepärast, et tõepoolest sõltumata sellest, kas see tuleb või ei tule, me kõik loodame, et see ei tule, aga me peame olema valmis selleks, kui ta tuleb. Ja siin on täpselt see, et me ei tea, mida toob tulevik, me ei tea, mis tuleb, aga me peame olema valmis selleks, nagu et tulla võib ka mitte kõige meeldivam stsenaarium. Nii et see puudutab ka kõiki kultuurilisi objekte ka. Ja kui täna üheks teemaks on siis seesama profülaktiline töö selle nimel, et säilitada kultuuripärandit. Meie Tallinnas teame väga hästi, mis on kultuuripärand. Põhimõtteliselt nagu meie linn ongi kultuuripärand, vähemalt UNESCO ütleb niimoodi. Et siis see on tegelikult väga, väga tõsine teema. Nii et ma soovin kõigile siis huvitavat päeva, vaadates neid teemasid, nagu ma arvan, et see on täiesti vältimatu, et see on huvitav. Nii et kindlasti igaüks leiab endale midagi, mis pakub temale huvi, nii professionaalselt kui ka puhtilikult. Ja siis ma kutsun kõiki nagu küsimusi esitada, sellepärast, et sellise kaliibriga külalisi, kes täna siia tuli, nagu et selles mõttes ei tule siia, ega me tuli iga päev. Nii et head päeva kõigile, хорошего всем конструктивного дня, and I wish everybody a good, interesting day here in Tallinn.
Head kolleegid, paluksin lugupeetud audoktorit ja lepime siis kokku, et pärast on võimalik esitada küsimusi, esineda sõnavõttudega. Ma arvan, et see teema võib pakkuda väga palju huvi mõnedes võib-olla spetsiifilistest aspektidest lähtuvalt. Nii et tunneme ennast koduselt, meil on väike auditoorium, kõik on omad inimesed. Nii et ma arvan, et kõik küsimused on pärast lubatud ja aktsepteeritud. Ja welcome.
Deputy Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me tell you what a great joy it is to be here back in Tallinn. I had the possibility over the time to come quite often to Tallinn, and it's always a pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me to come here, but also, of course, for the occasion that we are celebrating, that we are talking about, which is, of course, the Röhrich Society, the Röhrich Pact, and also Blue Shield, and some of the elements of the work that Blue Shield has been doing that I will be able to talk about. But let me tell you in the beginning, let me start with one thing. I have to ask the translators, if I start to speak too fast, you would probably hopefully let me know. I have a tendency of speaking very fast. I have 5 elder sisters, and I owe it to them when I was a kid, and I wanted to say something, I had to be very fast. So please just, when I'm getting too fast, just tell me that I'll break down a little bit. It is a great pleasure, especially for me as a member of the Blue Shield field of the Blue Shield work, to talk with our friends from the Röhrich Pact, because of course we see in the Röhrich Pact the ancestor of our work, the root base of which our work is coming from, and the work that has been done by Nikolaus Röhrich, the ideas that he has been conceiving are so important for us that they really are the basis on which we are building our work in the Blue Shield today. And so, of course, I think it is very meaningful when we are celebrating at the same time the 90th anniversary of the first International Congress of the Röhrig Pact, but also the 25th anniversary of Blue Shield. I will allow myself, since I think we have quite an amount of time, in the beginning to talk a little bit, a look back in the development over history between the Röhrig Pact, Blue Shield. Then I will go into the work of Blue Shield, the structure of Blue Shield, to see what is the work that we are actually doing today. And then after that, I will go into the specific case study on what has happened in Beirut, because I think what has happened in Beirut and the consequence of what we were able to work there and what the experience, what the lessons learned are that we are bringing in from Beirut is something that does not only apply to the type of catastrophes that we have seen in Beirut, but it really also applies to all type of disasters, of natural disasters, of human-made disasters, but also, of course, of armed conflict, because we should not forget that Blue Shield comes from a convention of the UNESCO that is dealing primarily with the question of the consequence of wars and armed conflicts. So we have to kind of keep this in mind a little bit. But of course, the preparatory work for any type of catastrophes or disaster is in broad strokes the same, and then gets specialized in the different type of catastrophes. So we are talking about, let me start in a different way. I was, 2 days ago, I was at a conference in Graz, in Austria, where we were talking about the fact that how long the concept of protection of cultural heritage is actually going back. And of course, in history, we find quite a couple of orders, quite a couple of instructions on how protection of cultural heritage has to happen. I am personally very proud that one of the first instructions to the military to protect cultural heritage was actually given by Empress Maria Theresia, not in form of a formal order, but she was instructing her military to try and prevent destruction of objects of culture. So we are going back literally for hundreds of years. But of course the idea to put this into a pact and form this into a transnational idea with a legal structure goes of course back to Nikolaus Röhrig. And I was stunned. I have the possibility also specifically also to the collaboration I'm having with Laila in Austria, with the Röhrig Society in Austria, to see this incredibly multifaceted genius that Nikolaus Röhrig was, and that many people know about his artistic background, his background as a scientist, but his background as not a lawyer is wrong, but as a legal scientist, I would say, constructing something like the Röhrig Pact is something that is not that well known, and I think it is incredibly important to point out the genius idea of creating an idea of a transnational contract for protection of cultural and scientific institutions, but also, of course, for creating a symbol for it. And when I am seeing you sitting there with the pins that show the symbol of the Röhrig Pact, it is something that always has a great significance for me, because I could see that the idea of creating this symbol was something which was incredibly fruitful as a consequence when UNESCO, as an international organization, was creating the idea of the Blue Shield and creating also the symbol of the Blue Shield. And we can see certain similarities there, which I always find very interesting and very important in this context. When I'm looking at the creation of Blue Shield and the idea how United Nations were starting with that idea, of course one has to go back to the Second World War. And one has to see the destruction that happened in the Second World War. And I hope you will forgive me that when I'm arguing my case here to you, I'm sometimes wearing my hat as being a military person. I'm an officer in the Austrian Armed Forces. I'm an officer who is a cultural property protection officer in the armed forces, but that does not mean that I had this staff function always. I was like a normal officer. I was a pilot in the Air Force in Austria for about 16 years before then taking onto the legal side and becoming a cultural property protection officer. So sometimes I'm kind of wearing my military hat, and sometimes I'm wearing my hat as representative of an UN-affiliated organization. So I have, let's say, two strands of which I'm coming to the argument of that case. So we have to see what happened in the Second World War, of the destruction of cultural heritage that happened in an absolutely tremendous way. If we are thinking, I'm always using this example, if you're looking at the destruction of Dresden on one side and the destruction of Coventry on the other side, you see that the way, the argument, how this destruction was happening, it was not an argument to destroy cultural heritage. It was collateral damage to a type of psychological warfare. So it is not the same argument that we are seeing today. It was literally, it was collateral damage. And what we have seen, and you will allow me to kind of move a little bit backwards and forwards in time, is just something that we see a very intense change in what actually is warfare. How is warfare happening? And I'm taking like a broad stroke here by going over 70 years of what happened in the last 70 years in warfare. We could see that there was an absolutely drastic change. I'm always very glad when I see that friends from the military are also sitting here because they know exactly what I'm talking about, which is that 70 years ago, the typical type of war was an international war, meaning war between nations. And war between nations meant you had armies clashing at each other, you had primary targets that were targeted in a conflict like this, which was usually the armed forces of the opponent, the infrastructure of the opposing state, the infrastructure, how the army was supported, government institutions, that were the targets. But of course, with the change in warfare from international warfare to inter-cultural warfare, inter-ethnic warfare, inter-religious warfare, which are, let's say, the three types of conflicts that we are seeing today. Also, the concept of what is a primary target has changed. So the primary target is not anymore the infrastructure of the opponent, but the primary target is the identity of the opponent. Most wars nowadays are wars against identity of the opponent. And of course, when you want to target the identity of the opponent, you are targeting their history, you are targeting their culture, the way how society is expressing themselves. And allow me just to bring in some of my personal experience that I had in this context, which I have, which really was driving me into the work that I'm doing today. So some of my experience are definitely going back to the time of the war in former Yugoslavia. I remember I was a pilot in the Austrian armed forces. I was always 4 days on duty, 3 days off duty. My air base was very close to the border with Slovenia. I had very good friends in Slovenia and Croatia, so always I was 4 days flying, and then the 3 days that I was free, I took my car and I was driving down to the front line, to the war zone, because I wanted to see directly, personally, on how that conflict was developing. And I had one experience that took me some time to really understand in all its depth. I was in Slavonia, in the, let's say, eastern part of Croatia, and the police was very well organized there. So when there was any military movement, the police would automatically stop the roads, divert the traffic. There was not a lot of traffic, but basically they knew, okay, there was a column of tanks coming one way, so they told everybody to kind of take another road. It was quite well organized. So I was driving there, but what happened sometimes was that because of the movement of the military there, you were stuck somewhere. So I was driving my car, the police was telling me I could not continue, and I couldn't also go backwards because there was somebody else in the back, and I just would have to get off the road and wait until the next day and keep on driving the next day. Something you were prepared to do at the time. So I drove my car into a little forest in the evening and said, okay, I'll just spend the night there and I'll continue the next day. And since I was bored basically and did not know what to do, I went for a walk. And so I crossed a little forest and I could see a village in the distance, in about 2 kilometers distance, and I could see that there was a column of tanks moving into the village. And I was going, this is going to be interesting. I mean, I'm just sitting here and I'm watching that. And what I saw actually was the column of tanks getting into the village, and the first thing they did was that the tanks went onto the cemetery and started to turn the tanks on the cemetery, on the graves, in order to destroy the tombstones. And of course I did not understand immediately what happened. It took me some time to understand that of course the concept was that it was a Serbian tank column that was driving in there, and they wanted to prove that the village probably had been historically Serbian, and therefore the proof that the population of the village in the past was, let's say, Croatian or of some other ethnicity, had to be destroyed. And that were the tombstones in this case. So they had to be destroyed. And for me it was very interesting because I could see this would become a pattern in the time of that conflict. And that was one of those things that drove me very much to the work that I'm actually doing today. But for me this was also a classical symbol to show how warfare in itself was actually changing and taking a new shape. Of course, what we also see today, when I was talking before about typical international warfare, is that it's really not existing anymore today, because practically all the conflicts we're seeing today are asymmetrical conflicts, meaning that usually you have an armed force on one side and you have a non-traditional force on the other side, which might not wear uniforms, which are using weapons that are non-traditional weapons, if you want, for armed conflicts. And of course, the military has to react appropriately to that. But let's say all of this is bringing us, I would say, into an important aspect on how also the legal background, and I'm sorry, I'm now taking off my military hat and I'm putting on my hat as a lawyer, which I'm in a civil profession, how the legal aspects for the protection of cultural heritage actually has to change, on how much the conventions were changing over time and how much the legal background for protection was actually changing over time. One little aspect that I like to put there in the beginning is, when we're talking about cultural heritage protection, is of course the question, what is culture? And again, as a lawyer, I'm looking at definitions in legal treatises on what is culture. And I can see that a lot of people with probably a lot more logical ideas than I have were trying to define what is actually culture. And the definitions, especially in all those UN conventions, are partly going over pages on what actually is culture. And I don't think anyone hits the real spot what is culture. I know when you bring this type of definitions, everybody goes to sleep. I know this for myself. I start hearing these sort of things, I go to sleep, no question. So I give you just one definition, which is my personal favorite definition of what is actually culture. There was a cultural anthropologist, Lord Raglan, who gave this definition in the 1930s in one of his absolutely great works. He was a contemporary of Niklas Röhrig, and I could almost imagine that these two great spirits must have met at some time. He was saying about culture the following. He said, his definition: culture is roughly everything we do and monkeys don't. And that is, of course, for me, the right approach to culture, because it is taking this holistic approach of culture, saying culture is much bigger than we usually think about it. Let's just take one specific aspect from that, and that is the element of material culture and immaterial culture. Immaterial culture was not playing any role in any legal definition until actually very recently, until about the year 2003, 2004. This is when all the amount of immaterial culture was starting to play a legal role. But of course we should not forget that all the immaterial side of culture is infinitely bigger than the material side of culture. It's just easier to define the material kind of culture. The immaterial kind of culture was, they were trying to put the definition to it, which happened then in one of the UNESCO conventions of 2004, or the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention from 2004, where they were trying to group the intangible or immaterial culture into 5 big areas. A lot of them are very tangible, by the way, are not that intangible, but they're coming basically from ideas. And they're very logical when you look into it. For example, music. Music is a typical, intangible, immaterial culture, but an incredibly important part of our culture. Then it is the whole question of, for example, indigenous medicine, the knowledge about health, which is definitely an incredibly important part of our culture, about the way we live, about all of our societies, but it is intangible. It is basically a tradition of ideas. It is the whole aspect of crafts. So crafts play a big role in how societies are expressing their culture. It is tangible, but it belongs part to the intangible side, because it will not be mentioned with the normal tangible side. These are elements which I think is incredibly important, but also again very difficult to describe directly. It's the question of language. So we have today roughly 6,800 languages in the world, which are real languages. They are not dialects. We're talking about real languages. Those languages, every language represents a specific perspective on the world, on culture. I'm always telling my children, I love languages. I'm trying to make my children learn as many languages as possible, because I'm telling them, with every language you learn, you are doubling your knowledge. You're not adding to your knowledge something, you are doubling your knowledge, because you learn a new perspective to look at things. So language is a huge, important amount of our culture, of the culture that we are having in the world. So we are losing about one language every 6 weeks. I totally understand anybody who has great environmental concerns, and I am supporting this, and animals that are dying out, but one of the biggest concerns that I have is also the fact that we are losing our identity by losing, for example, languages. Because with the same logic of saying you are doubling your knowledge with every language, means every language that dies out halves the culture. So there's a great loss that is actually happening on a very regular basis, because many of those languages are not documented, they don't have a form of writing, it is very difficult to keep them. So this is just to see how broad culture actually is. In Blue Shield, this has a very specific meaning. That means when we are, for example, training soldiers for an international mission, and we are supposed to train them on cultural heritage protection, so the first thing I will have to tell them is the first element you will meet is most likely intangible cultural heritage. It is the fact that you're in a conflict area where there is a religious expression or a demonstration or some sort of a convoy or a theater play or something like this happening, which is supposed to be forbidden by the other side, or the use of language, which is supposed to be forbidden by the other side. That's not tangible cultural heritage, that's all the intangible cultural heritage. And you have to take this into consideration, because culture is something very big and very broad. I mean, I took the chance a couple of times. I do not think it would work with you as a group, but when I had mixed groups, I gave them all a piece of paper when we had enough time, and I said, write down your definition of culture in one sentence. And it was fascinating to see on how many different opinions you were getting this way, because everybody has a little bit his own different approach to culture, and this is also really part of our identity, of the identity that we are having. So you see the changes in what is the approach to culture, what's the definition to culture, the changes in conflict, in warfare. Now, of course, there are legal changes that are happening. In 1954, you had, as a consequence of the Second World War, the first big convention dealing, the so-called Hague Convention, that is dealing with the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflicts. You had several other conventions that were following, particularly in the 80s. You had the World Heritage Convention, you had the Underwater Protection Convention, many other conventions. The problem was, and I hope you forgive me for saying this a bit flippant, is the fact that if you look directly at the 1954 conventions, it said, yes, it is forbidden to use cultural heritage or objects of culture during conflicts. But what was the consequence if you did misuse it? The consequence was, if you were really in a bad situation, was that the UNESCO was wagging its finger and said, you're a naughty boy, you shouldn't be doing this. And that is not exactly a consequence that is very impressive to a soldier who is in a conflict in a field or in a war in a field. So the convention was lacking teeth. It was lacking effect of it. So one important change that came in this legal dimension was in 1999, when a second protocol was created to the 1954 Convention for Protection of Cultural Heritage in Armed Conflicts, which had two elements in it, which were incredibly important. One element was that it did not say, well, if there is damage or misuse of cultural heritage, the army is responsible. But it clearly said, no, the individual soldier is responsible. That had an incredible consequence, as we have seen in the following years when it came to the war in former Yugoslavia, the blowing up of the bridge in Mostar, for example, where the responsibility for certain acts were put onto certain individuals. So this individual responsibility was there. But this second protocol from '99 also said it is not just, like something you shouldn't be doing, but it is part of criminal law to misuse cultural heritage. And that, of course, gives it a complete new dimension. And then, relatively soon, we had an international criminal court. I mean, the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court is from the year 1999. The ICC, the court in The Hague, started to work in 2001 or 2002. And we actually had, as a consequence, a court of law in which a violation of this convention could be brought to bear. And it has happened. I'm sure you have probably heard in the media that just a couple of months ago, for example, somebody who was responsible for the destruction of sacred sites in Mali, in Timbuktu, there were grave sites and they were destroyed by him, had been brought to justice in the court of The Hague, in the International Criminal Court, and actually is in jail there for the destruction of cultural heritage he has done in Mali. So suddenly this convention was getting teeth. It was getting a court that could operate with it. And then one next step, and I promise I won't put more legal work in front of you, but I think one very important step was happening in 2015, also in connection with Mali, as the example I was mentioning to you, and that was the fact that the UN Security Council passed a resolution where they were creating the mission force that was operating in Mali, the so-called MINUSMA force, the international forces active in Mali, and in their duty, in the order to that force, the protection of cultural heritage was for the first time put as an obligation of an international force. So that's something which was, of course, also a huge step forward, because we have to be quite aware on how military operates, and probably sometimes one has to be part of the military to understand how military operates. Military are people that are getting an order, but the order, in the first instance, is given not by other military, but by politicians. They are creating a framework in which the military will operate to their best knowledge with the material they are getting to fulfill this duty. They will definitely, in most cases, do a really good job within the framework which is created for them, within the framework of their training, their material, and the mandate that they are getting. So if a soldier does not get the mandate to look after cultural heritage, he will not do it. If he does not get the training and the material to do it, he will not do it. And therefore, the fact that for the first time, a UN Security Council resolution was mentioning that from now on, basically, international missions have the responsibility to look after cultural heritage, that was a tremendous step forward for all the people working in that type of community, and also for us working actually in this training area. But let me come from here a little bit to the Blue Shield. What is Blue Shield doing today? How are we operating? What have been the activities? We are celebrating 25 years of Blue Shield. Actually, on the 6th of June, 25 years ago, the first meeting happened from the representative of those organizations that were called responsible to create the Blue Shield by UNESCO, which are the so-called umbrella organizations, the big cultural international organizations, which is the International Council of Museums, ICOM for the museums, which is ICOMOS, representing, archaeology, sites. Then it is the ICA, the International Council of Archives, for archives obviously, and the International Federation for Libraries and Archives, which is responsible for libraries. The 4 representatives or secretary generals of that organization were meeting on the 6th of June in '96 to basically make for the first time a statement about Blue Shield. We all know that sometimes certain organizations don't work very fast. So it took quite some time to make the step from there to the next step of actually institutionalizing Blue Shield. It was a very important step in '96 because from then on, certain national committees were starting to create themselves, which had the representatives of these umbrella organizations, but also of state institutions as part of it, to basically start acting on a national level. But let's say the activity on the international level was not that fast. That actually took until about 2008. In 2008, the existing national committees, which were 26 at the time, were coming together and said we have to create the international institution that will be the partner to UNESCO as prescribed by the Hague Convention and its protocols. And they were getting together with the founding organizations and created this organization called the Blue Shield, or the Association of National Committees of the Blue Shield. But of course at that time it was still, as you could see from the founding members, it was an organization that was mainly dealing with material cultural institutions. And as it happens quite often in these type of institutions, the debate was going on before that conference in a very intense way of who should be the lead agency, who is going to lead that organization, so which element of culture would basically be the dominant factor there. And since they could not come to a result, and they suddenly saw at the conference that there was somebody who was not part of this lead agency, but who in a very strange way had a military background, and that was me in this case. So they were, I had the great honor to be elected the founding president of Blue Shield at the time. And one of my first activities was that I went to the assembly and I told them, even before I was elected, I said, you're electing a soldier. And that's the first time in this organization. But that means, of course, what I want to make sure is that also the military aspect, since we are talking about armed conflicts, the military aspect will have to play an important role in Blue Shield, which they accepted. Not very lightly, but they accepted it. So I'll give you an example. I don't know if there are any archaeologists here, but archaeologists tended to have in the past an approach where they said, since most archaeology is happening in fields where there are armed conflicts, if we just think about the Middle East or these sort of places which are incredibly rich in archaeological fields, is that they said, we, as a matter of principle, never talk to anybody in uniform. And I saw that there's a problem. Yeah, we have to overcome that problem. You have to, I always said, if your house is on fire, whom do you call? Do you call the fire brigade or do you call your architect? And in the same way, if you have a conflict over an archaeological site, you have to deal with the military involved in it. If possible, get them to also help protect the sites. That's very important. But you have to deal with them in some way. And we had actually conferences right in the beginning, which I remember quite well. For example, from the World Archaeological Congress, where some of my colleagues and me, we were invited to give a presentation on the impact or the interaction between conflict and archaeology. And when we arrived there, this was happening in Dublin, there were very venerable university professors who were creating a human chain in front of the hall where the conference was taking place, and said, we will never let anybody in uniform, or we will never let a soldier come and talk to us because these are people we don't want to deal with. And it went so far that these venerable professors started a fist fight, and they had to call the police actually to separate them between those that said we have to talk to them and we don't talk to them. But then luckily this situation is really quite some time ago. And we see that it was very much the American Association of Archaeologists who started to invite military personnel. I remember very well the first conference where this was happening. There were 2 soldiers that were speaking there. One was an American general talking for civil affairs, and another one was me, and they were asking me to appear in uniform, so I had to get special permission from the Austrian armed forces to appear in the United States in uniform, because they said if I as a foreigner are on the podium together with an American general, at least our members might not throw foul eggs and tomatoes at us. So it was like, it really was quite an intense situation, but then it really became much better. And I have to say that nowadays, there is almost no archaeological congress where the military component is not also represented there, and the interaction between military and archaeologists has become a much, much better field. So, and it was my main idea was that I wanted the integration of the military also, especially on the national level, into the national committees of Blue Shield, so that there would be a collaboration. The collaboration would be particularly important also because one of the big parts that Blue Shield has taken on was, of course, the fact of training with soldiers, how to operate in a cultural field, how to do cultural triage, one of the most complicated things. I don't think there is a recipe to it, but I remember very well when I was taking soldiers, and that also applies to myself, and we did the first exercise in some museums, and of course we suddenly saw, you know, important paintings somewhere, nobody there is touching them. But if you're in a crisis situation, I mean, that becomes very complicated. I will never forget an international exercise we made in Austria with the Austrian armed forces, and we had about 15 countries present, and it was happening in Vorarlberg. And we made an exercise that was happening in the town, in the city of Bregenz, and there's a little museum there. And we incorporated the museum into this exercise. And so we were putting soldiers, always, you know, teams of 3 from different countries together, try to put one legal expert together with a tactical officer, together with a 3rd officer. And we said one of the things you have to do is you have to get into the museum. You are getting a theoretical transport capacity, time, so many forces of soldiers that can help you. What of this museum which is threatened are you going to save, and what are you going to leave behind? And respectively on how they acted, they were getting good points or bad points. And I was in this museum as one of the overseers, as one of the trainers, and I have to tell you, I was laughing, I had tears running down my face for laughing, because there were, of course, normal visitors in the museum who had no idea what was happening. And you saw these teams of 3 soldiers in uniform coming into this museum and going like, oh wait, let's take this piece, and no, this piece, that's nonsense, we just leave it here, that's completely uninspiring. And let's take this, oh, that's looking good. Oh, and this one is small, we can take it easily with the transport capacity we have. These guys were not getting a lot of points, as you can imagine. The ones that were getting the points were, of course, those that went first to, let's say, the cashier selling the tickets at the beginning and asking him, what is important for you? What is representing what you want to have represented in the museum? And these were the pieces after which you should go and then basically help and save them. So these were very interesting sort of experience that we had, and it just needs some training of soldiers to do that and get the material to prepare of what you can do there. So training aspect was becoming very important. Then, of course, what became very important was the fact that Blue Shield was able to send missions to conflict areas, to observe what was happening there, to document possible damage or activities that are happening there. That is, of course, work that is constantly ongoing, and try and coordinate help if it's necessary in the place. And there, in the history since 2008, until now, of course, there were many missions that happened. I have to admit one thing to you. When I was getting elected president in 2008, there were not very many conflicts in this world. It was a relatively calm time, and I was going like, oh, this is going to be a cool job. I won't have too much to do. I will have to look after training and things like this, but there's not too much happening. And boy, was I wrong. Yeah? There were so many conflicts coming up very soon after that. The first was actually not a conflict, but was a natural disaster. It was the big earthquake in Haiti. You remember, in 2009, beginning of 2009, which led to a great destruction in the city of Port-au-Prince and in the surrounding areas. And we had immediately, within a couple of days, we had 2 teams there, one team from France, one team from the United States, to try, A, to distribute blue shield signs, to put signs to symbols, to elements that are part of culture, so when they would clear the area, that this would not just be discarded. I'll give you again a practical example of what happened. The Cathedral of Port-au-Prince has an important historic value because it has the oldest frescoes in the Caribbean. It had it on the inside, on the front side. And the whole front of the cathedral was falling down in the earthquake, but it was falling on one of the main roads that are leading through Port-au-Prince. So this was one of the ideas where I thought we have to see, these frescoes can be saved, there is no question about that, but we have to be there fast because people will want the road back. And I have to admit we were too late. And although I was there a couple of days afterwards, a certain country, I will not mention the United States here of course, came in with some bulldozers and bulldozed the whole thing away, and of course the frescoes were completely destroyed and it was not worthwhile doing any reconstruction there. And so one of the first things we wanted to do is mark down with the blue shield signs, that's the important of the signs which I mentioned in the beginning, mark down with those signs which are the objects worthwhile protecting and holding. So this happened. Then of course, as a further consequence for the work, we had, apart from some smaller conflicts, one of the big things that came up was the so-called Arab Spring. And everything that happened starting, it started in Tunisia, but we were not active in Tunisia, but then actually it went to Egypt. And we started to become very active as Blue Shield in Egypt, because it was a really strange area which mainly affected the area surrounding Cairo. So all the area of the pyramids, the whole area of Gizeh was affected through the demonstrations and through the fact that the police had dissolved. There is in Egypt a police which is a tourism and archaeological police. They are in charge for protecting those sites. That police had just dissolved. They were not there anymore. So we created some teams from Blue Shield that went around to the sites and tried to help and tried to preserve wherever it was possible, but also make the connection with the Egyptian military to create a special, I would say, structure where I was down there. I had the possibility of having connections with the Egyptian military before, and that is always so important because I was participating in some of the military exercises, so-called Bright Star exercises in Egypt, before to talk about cultural heritage. So I knew some of the officers there. I called them up and I said, help me, we need to preserve some safe spaces for the culture in this area. And their immediate reaction as soldiers was, that's not our responsibility. We have nothing to do with that. So I said, okay, I understand that, but how about the following? You are in charge of preserving certain objects. If this is not an object of cultural importance, can you preserve certain warehouses? And they were going like, yeah, I think we could do that. So I said, let's designate some warehouses and see that we transport some of the important movable objects from the area of Gizeh into those warehouses, which were then protected by the military. And I have to tell you, I'm a very evil person. I had so much fun doing this work because I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't really understand the full importance of that. But I like torturing people some, not really, but I mean in some way. So I remember so many situations where I was sitting, going down there with the team. We went to some site, and from that site where everybody had left, there were no tourists, no police, no archaeologists, nobody, only looters, and some locals that were trying to preserve the place. So we went to the sites, And then I called up, I had a switchboard through which I could call up the archaeologist in charge. And let's say I was at the site where the archaeologist in charge was in the US. I called the poor guy up, said, "Professor, I know it is 3 o'clock in the morning for you, I'm terribly sorry about that, but I'm standing at your site in Egypt." And they were very excited. They were like, "Oh, okay, fantastic." So I said, let me give you a quick description on what I see, because I have to tell you, please keep in mind, I'm a soldier, I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm definitely not an Egyptologist. So I can only tell you, I can see this and this is my direction, I can see to my left in a field, there has been digging going on, to my right in 150 meters, I can see a bulldozer or a caterpillar, which of course puts everybody in a complete hectic, as you can imagine. I can see that 2 of your warehouses have been broken open and 2 of them are still closed. And now let me tell you what I can do for you. What I can do for you is, I have 2 trucks which can transport 7.5 tons. I have 6 guys with me, and I have 6 hours time to bring whatever you want me to bring with this capacity into a safe place, into a safe storage place. And this was the moment when this professor almost had a heart attack. Because for them to take the decision, this is important and that is important and something else is not important, was just something they are not trained to do. But I had to force them to take those fast decisions. And that was something which I'd much rather do beforehand in a training with people, instead of in the moment when it's happening, because that was a very, very difficult task and responsibility for those archaeologists to take. And I think it was my advantage that I'm not an archaeologist, so I had no problem with that. I just said, tell me what to do, I'm here, I can do it. What you cannot afford to do is do nothing. So you have to do something. And I think this way we were able to kind of preserve a lot of things. But of course, at the same time, while we were doing this in Egypt, we could see that things started to happen in Libya. And so we became active on a very early stage in Libya. So we were able to do some training with some of the specialists, especially of the archaeological sites. And we were able to support them during the entire conflict in Libya. And that was the first time we were able to create something, which we call the cultural no-strike list. So from the militaries know, when you have a military mission, you have a no-strike list, which means, for example, you should not damage diplomatic sites, or you should not damage cultural sites, or you should not damage hospitals or embassies or anything like this. And we said the responsibility of those countries that are part of the Hague Convention is not to damage, not to misuse cultural sites. So let's put a couple of the important cultural sites onto the no-strike list. Many military at the time were telling me, impossible, you can't do that. And I said, well, let me try and do this. So I was getting in touch with the no-strike office of NATO, which is in Washington, and talked to the commander, which is a colonel, and I told him what my intention was. And he said, well, I agree with you, we should try it. I'm not sure anybody will respect it, but let's try it out. So I said, okay, how many objects can I put on your list regarding Libya? And he was going like, well, I can't give you a fixed number, but how about, and this is really a random number, I mean, this is not something which is legally or fixed. He said, how about we try and put 300 points onto the no-strike list. I said, okay, what do you need? Yeah, I need the geolocation. I need to know where the stuff is, exactly. Otherwise I can't put it on. And the description. I said, let me see what I can do. So I was talking to the representatives of the big cultural organizations, and I said, I need everything you have on Libya, but only when it has a geolocation, when you know really where it is. I have to tell you, within 5 or 6 days, I had about 94,000 points in Libya with cultural objects. To which I said, I'm terribly sorry, but I mean, we were all working as it was happening. So we were going like, there's not very much I can do with this list. But for me, the most important thing is, I don't want us to work on that list. I want Libyans, I want locals to work on this list, to say what is important for them. It's not the question what is important for me. I mean, a World Heritage Site, Leptis Magna, is very easy. I mean, of course, that's the point. But when it comes a little bit more into detail, I need the input from my friends or from the specialists in Libya to say what is important to them. So we were working this way, and you can imagine the work it took to get from 94,000 to 300. But we did manage within a couple of days. And I have to say, of course, I do not know how the military were actually using it. But what we did is we had teams in place that were very often checking those 300 sites that we had pointed out. And we could see that out of the 300 sites we had pointed out, there was only one site that was damaged, and that had collateral damage. That was not a direct hit or anything like this. So I think it does work. And what was very interesting was, of course, that as a consequence of that, when people saw this is something that works, that can be used, it has value, you know, one says success has many fathers, yeah? And it's only the opposite of success, which is an orphan. So there were, of course, many people saying like, oh, this was my idea, this was my idea, we did this. Well, I know exactly who did it and who had the first idea. It was not me, it was a colleague of mine who had the first idea. It was a Dutch officer who came up with the concept. It was mainly the American Blue Shield representatives that compiled everything, that did it. So I'm not claiming this for me, but I'm claiming it for Blue Shield. That this was the first organization putting that together and really making it work. And it really has become a bit of, you know, the normal staple work on what's happening today when you have a conflict with regular armed forces, that they start to deal with the question, where are the cultural heritage sites? So then we came to a point after the activities we did in the so-called Arab Spring, where a lot of, when conflicts happened somewhere, we were asked to contribute with our knowledge and participate in it. Typical example was Mali. So when the conflict in Mali started, the north was taken over by the Al-Qaeda forces or by Ansar Din, and the French, together with the Malian armed forces, decided that they have to retake the north. I was called up by the commander of the Malian forces for the retaking of the north, who was again a friend of mine who I had met at a conference a couple of years before. So the personal connections are, of course, always incredibly important. Who said, do you think you could contribute to that? I said, okay, if you want me to, I'm coming, I'm there, yeah? To advise directly during the mission what to do. So I went actually with the Malian armed forces during the mission in the north of Mali, the retaking of Timbuktu, and then going up to Gao. And we were able to kind of put the ideas of protecting cultural heritage very much into that mission. And I have to say that during the occupation, a lot of damage was happening, but in this retaking of the north, almost nothing was happening, and especially a site like Timbuktu, which is a World Heritage Site, which is incredibly fragile because it's all mud brick buildings. So that was something which was of great importance, and I have to say we have to be very glad that it was working out. Of course, very often, a lot of the difficulties come after the conflict. Like, for example, in Libya nowadays, I know much less of what's happening in Libya nowadays than was happening during the conflict. And it's much more complicated to visit the sites now than it was during the conflict. And Mali is also a place like this where it is quite difficult to do that. But at least we have certain systems inside to protect the cultural heritage there. And then, of course, you had the conflicts, and I'm not going too much into that. In Syria, we have currently the conflicts in Karabakh on one side, mainly on the side of Azerbaijan. Of course, it is very interesting and important to check the sites which are in those territories. And of course, nonetheless, the conflict that we're currently having in Ethiopia, where you have a World Heritage Site like the city of Aksum, where a lot of the conflict is happening around that site, birthplace of the Queen of Sheba. I mean, it is of great historic importance. We are currently collecting the material on what is happening there as much as we can. Of course, social media is helping tremendously in our work because we are getting a lot of material that otherwise we wouldn't be getting. And I will definitely try still this year, definitely this autumn, to get one mission to Karabakh and one mission also to Ethiopia to look at those sites and see what can be done. But at that stage, that I've already talked a lot to you, and I apologize for talking that long, I of course want to come to one of the main cases, which was the so-called Beirut blast. It was the explosion, what happened in Beirut. I have as you have seen it before, I have worked on I haven't worked. It's a PowerPoint presentation which I have here, it is not my PowerPoint presentation, it is a PowerPoint presentation of some of my colleagues in Lebanon, and I would just like to show you a couple of pictures and a couple of little videos on things that happened in Beirut and what was the consequence of it and what has happened since then in order to preserve these places. But maybe allow me before to talk a little bit about what really happened there. Because I was in Beirut on the 3rd day after the explosion. I was flying down there straight away in order to see how Blue Shield can act. We had in Beirut an ideal situation, and this sounds terrible when you call it an ideal situation because of what happened was so terrible. But the ideal situation was that for years before that, we as Blue Shield have been training with the Lebanese armed forces on one side and with the UN forces, with UNIFIL forces on the other side in Lebanon in the question of cultural heritage protection. Which meant when we came down there, we had directly access to quite a big group of people that we had trained beforehand. We had access to the military that we were able to use immediately to start immediately with some preservation work and working on some objects which were in a very complicated situation because nobody else would touch them. And so you needed these institutions like the military to actually go and touch those objects. So therefore I say it was more or less an ideal situation. The difficulties to get it to use were of course tremendous. I'll mention a couple of those. The difficulty was, for example, that the United Nations troops are not allowed to work outside their so-called area of operation. The area of operation in Lebanon is southern Lebanon, and the city of Beirut is outside the area of operation. So I knew we had to get to New York, get to the UN Security Council, get the permission from the UN Security Council for the UN troops to become active in Beirut. I was personally thinking this is going to take us weeks. But I have to say, it was working within 48 hours, we were getting permissions for them to come and work. Then we had to coordinate the work between the Lebanese armed forces and the UN troops. A lot of it I can show you when I show you the pictures and tell you when I show you the pictures. I think what is probably very important is to imagine the dimension of the explosion that happened there, because it's very complicated to imagine what has happened there. I tell you from my personal experience, I have been for the last 35 years in practically every major conflict that has happened and in very destroyed areas, also natural disaster areas. I have only once in my life seen a city as destroyed as Beirut after the blast. And the only city that I've seen as destroyed was Grozny after the 3rd time that Russia bombed down the city of Grozny. That was even more destroyed. But the way how Beirut, or this part of Beirut, was destroyed was absolutely incredible, because of course it was affecting such an important part of the cultural heritage of Beirut, and it was foreseeable that it would really change the society in Beirut tremendously, and it's a very, very sensitive society that is living in Beirut because of the different religions that are represented in the different quarters of Beirut. But let me talk a bit about the explosion. I'm sorry, I'm kind of, you know, there's the soldier in me coming through when I'm talking about the explosion. We're talking, there were 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that were exploding. We must imagine the following. From the 10 biggest explosions, which were man-made and not nuclear, 9 of the 10 biggest explosions was ammonium nitrate. The explosion that happened in Beirut was, and there is a debate about it, whether it was the 3rd or the 4th biggest man-made non-nuclear explosion that happened. Whether it's the 3rd or the 4th, it doesn't matter. It was absolutely huge. You must imagine the following. Just the pure crater that it was hitting under the storage facility where the ammonium nitrate was stored. You know, usually when you want to blow something up, you have to you have to create a barrier to direct the explosion in the direction where you want to have it. In this case, the explosion would clearly go purely in the air because the solid ground was under the storage facility. And still the explosion was so strong that it created a crater that was 45 meters deep and had 130 meters in diameter. You can practically not see it today because it filled with seawater immediately. But actually, this crater is just absolutely tremendous when you imagine that. The explosion happened, and I say luckily in quotes, unquotes, at a good time. It happened after work hours. If it would have happened 45 minutes earlier, it would have been an absolute disaster of people that would have died in this explosion. This way, there were 204 people that died in the explosion. There were about 6,500 people injured. I guess the number was much bigger because many injuries were just not reported. Smaller injuries were just not reported. These are only, let's say, the grave injuries. But, and that's the figure which is incredible, it created 300,000 homeless people. 300,000 people lost their house, their ability to stay somewhere. And that's for me really something which is absolutely incredible. And since it was directed at one of the historic quarters, the Christian quarter of Beirut, it was affecting, and I know this of course because that's the main Blue Shield work, was affecting about 650 historic buildings. And in these historic buildings there were 12 museums, there were lots of archives, there were lots of libraries. But of course, something which we cannot count, I have no figure for that, is the crafts. You can imagine the small craftsmen which are creating something which are local specialties, whose livelihood was destroyed through that blast. I don't have a figure for it, but it is tremendous. It is really great. It really, not great, it's really terrible on what really happened there. The US Geological Survey, actually, they were categorizing it like an earthquake. And they were categorizing it as an earthquake that was happening on the surface with a strength of 3.3. So usually the earthquakes are down in the earth, so they're losing a lot on the way up. 3.3 on the surface is tremendously strong. And I just give you personal experience which I saw there. We could find flying debris at the distance of about 6 to 7 kilometers. I was in buildings that had concrete walls. I could see splinters of old glass that had buried themselves in the concrete wall to about 6 centimeter depth. So if you imagine that glass is very fragile, you must imagine the impact, the force it had actually to kind of impact a place like this. You had, in a surrounding of about 2 to 2.5 kilometers, there was not a single window that would exist anymore. And one of the strongest memories I have from these first days in Beirut was when you were walking around the streets of Beirut. There was a very specific sound, because the entire ground was covered with very small glass splinters from all the glasses that had shattered. And you had constantly the sound, you know, this knirsch, knirsch of walking on glass. It's a very specific sound that you can have. So the biggest explosion that happened was in 1918, was in Halifax in Canada. That was also a boat full of ammonium nitrate, killed about 12,000 people. 8,000 of the people that were killed by the tsunami wave that the explosion created in this boat, which was blowing up. I mean, it is absolutely, this is a tremendous force that can be that can happen with ammonium nitrate. Maybe I should explain a little bit what ammonium nitrate is. So ammonium nitrate is something that comes in powder form, and it's used for two different reasons. It is used as fertilizer, or it is used as explosive in mining. And it is very, very cheap material. That's why when people have ammonium nitrate lying somewhere, and it's a difficulty for them to retrieve it, they'd rather just leave it, because the money is not worthwhile retrieving it, because it's very cheap material. And that's basically what happened in Beirut. And I'll tell you the little story, if we have enough time. I'll tell you the story on how it happened to come to that explosion in Beirut, and then I hope I really should go into showing you some pictures from there. But I mean, the story is really quite wild. Like all good stories, it starts with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a terribly bad boat called the MV Rezus. And the MV Rezus was flying under Moldovan flag. The owner was a Panamanian company. The de facto owner was Russian. And he had an owner that was fronting him, who was Cypriot. And on the 27th of September 2013, so this was like 7 years before the explosion happened, the boat was chartered to go to Georgia, take on a load of ammonium nitrate, and ship it down to Mozambique. So the port of destination was Beirut in Mozambique for the mining activities there as an explosive. And on the 21st of November 2013, so that was like 2 months after it had taken on its load in Georgia, it was passing in front of Beirut. It was having some damage, supposedly, so it went into the harbor of Beirut to fix the damage on the engine. What we are assuming, looking into the case today, also into the legal side of the case, was that the boat was supposed to cross the Suez Canal. But as you have seen from the description before, this was a complete fishy society, that they just didn't have the money to cross the Suez Canal. So because that's quite an expensive undertaking. So what those ships sometimes do is they go to port under some argument before, and they try to get another load. Somebody who wants to bring things also to Africa, and with this other load, then they are paying for their passage of the Suez Canal. So we think this boat just came into Beirut to find another load, and they found the possibility of getting machine parts that were also supposed to be brought, I think, to Kenya. I'm not quite sure about that. But upon loading of these machine parts, the deck of the ship was again damaged. And the damage at that stage was so big that the harbor captain said the boat cannot leave anymore until they have repaired the ship. The ship was so old that the owner said, well, I'm not repairing it. I leave the boat there. So the boat stayed there with a crew that would not allow to leave the boat. They were suddenly running out of energy, they were running out of water, they were running out of food. Organizations had to come in to provide them. The crew was mainly Ukrainian, it was Russian, and it was, I think, a Greek Cypriot captain on that boat. And so finally most of the crew could go home, which was very good. Only 3 people stayed on board of the crew. That then also, after a court case, they went home. And in the year 2018, so that was 2 years earlier, it was decided that the harbor captain decided that the load of ammonium nitrate is too dangerous there on the boat because the boat is so heavily damaged. We have to take it out and put it in the storage facility. So they took it out, put it in the storage facility in the harbor, in the big facility number 12, and they were very lucky because a couple of months later the boat sank in the harbor because it was so damaged. So the boat basically was gone. Nobody claimed the ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate normally does not explode. It has an explosive point of about 1,500 degrees, so it needs a lot of heat to get it burning. It becomes explosive when it becomes compacted. And of course, having ammonium nitrate in a harbor close to a sea is a very dangerous thing because it becomes humid and then it dries again. It becomes humid and dries again, and humid and dry. And with that, it's becoming more and more compacted. And the more it gets compacted over time, the more it becomes explosive. Then a couple of things happened in Beirut, which in the same storage facility, they were also storing some fireworks, which is not a very good neighborhood, as you can imagine, although they were supposedly separated. And then basically from there onwards, nobody really knew what happened. There were 2 explosions. First explosion was on the 4th of August last year at 7 minutes past 6 in the evening. As I said, it was luckily after work hours. the first explosion happened, then 35 seconds later, the second explosion happened. I'm sure you have seen some of the videos of the explosion and what happened, and it's absolutely terrifying on absolutely what happened. And let me give you some examples which are not the cultural examples, because that I'll show you on the pictures later. But what was incredible, with every explosion, you have two effects. You have basically a pressure wave that goes away from the explosion, and then a vacuum gets created in the middle, and so you have another wave where the air gets pulled back in again. And so very often what doesn't get destroyed with the explosion gets then destroyed with the implosion of the pressure wave coming actually back into it. And if you imagine that most of the houses there are traditional old houses that have normal tiled roofs, that have basically the whole structure of the roof is just sitting on the house and keeping the house together, you can imagine that with that, very often the wave, the first wave of the explosion went through and broke all the glasses, created kind of vacuum on the inside, created first a sort of pressure on the inside, which was lifting up the roof. The roof was very often lifted up by about half a meter, very often destroying all the tiling on the top. And then the vacuum came and sucked the roof back on. So the roof then was slammed down onto the house, which in most cases just basically broke the backbone of the house, which was breaking the walls which were there. So very often the house was actually still standing when you saw it, but it was dead, because all the main walls were broken, the roof was broken, so it was absolutely an incredible situation. I saw cars there, very impressive. Cars that were broken not by debris that was falling on top, but just the pressure wave was so strong that it was pushing the roof of the car into the car. And it was not the debris on top. But imagine that type of pressure that was happening there. Absolutely incredible. So the main areas which were affected was, of course, the area around the harbor, the Christian part of Beirut. And just two more sentences to the structure of society there. If you imagine this, the Christian part, of course, you have another part which is mainly populated by Wahhabi Muslims coming from Saudi Arabia, coming from this area. And then, of course, you have other Muslim groups that are also living in the town. And there has been a strong move over the last couple of years, after the civil war ended in 2006, from the side of especially the Saudi Arabian, the Wahhabi Muslims, to come into the Christian part of Beirut and buy houses in the Christian part in order to change the identity of the town and make it a real Muslim town. And this society was kind of holding up against that, and they said, no, we have been, that's the last Arab country, if you want, that still has a very strong Christian population in itself. So what happened after the blast was, of course, that a lot of those people whose houses were destroyed, who had no money for reconstruction, who had to go to the countryside or try and have relatives somewhere else or find some possibility to go out, when they were at their house looking at it, you had representatives from Saudi Arabia coming with a little suitcase, and they said, here's the suitcase, it's full of money, here is the contract, how about you sign? You can't pay for the house anyway to reconstruct it. Just sign, we'll buy the house, and you have a lot of money. And you can imagine that the temptation for a lot of the population was very high to do it. So for us, the interest was also that we said, if we want to keep the identity of Beirut, we have to try and preserve the old parts of Beirut in a way that we make the houses livable again. What we should do is try to make sure that the roof is covered, that the windows are covered, that the doors are not as fixed doors, but at least close the house in some way, then people can start with the reconstruction on the inside. The explosion was beginning of August. We knew the first rain would be coming by second half of October. So we said, okay, we have to go and really try and get this done by the second half of October, give the people the possibility to come back before the water is putting more damage to that. So that was our precondition, and I think that's the moment where I should then start with with a couple of those pictures, give you a little bit of an impression of before and after.